Every once in a while, a story will just take you. Some series will just grab you and not let you go until you've enjoyed every last word, every last image of it. And exactly this happened to me not too long ago as I discovered Vinland Saga. After watching the first 4 episodes, I decided I did not want to wait a week for each episode, so I dove straight into the manga and binged it. And it was one of the best experiences I've had with manga. It's now in my top 4 manga of all time. And while there are many subjects we could discuss here, and many subjects I would like to discuss in the future, for today, I would like to focus on how Vinland Saga utilizes contrast in its themes. But to get things started, what does contrast even mean? In the most basic terms, a contrast is a property by which the differences and contradictions between two or more entities are highlighted. You probably know it best from art, where contrast between light and dark is often a helpful tool for bringing out the clarity and features of any given image. This can also be used by contrast between colors. But if you read manga, you're probably even more familiar with the black and white variant, as the black and white nature of manga makes contrast both easy and effective. Tite Kubo, author of Bleach, is especially talented at this, his use of full blacks against white backgrounds creating some truly memorable imagery. You should definitely check out his art, both on Bleach and other things, if you want to have a good idea of how contrast can work. But today, we're not talking about visual contrast. Instead, we're talking about thematic contrast. Because just as an artist can use light and dark, or different color areas to highlight his image, an author can use conflicting thematic ideas to further flesh them out by comparing and contrasting them. And that is exactly what Makoto Yukimura does with Vinland Saga. Vinland Saga is, as you probably know, centered around Vikings. Taking place during the beginning of the first millennia, it depicts the exploits of Thorfinn, a young Viking warrior during the so-called Golden Age of Vikings. Vikings were, historically, a general assembly of Norse tribes that raided and pillaged most of Europe between 798 and 1066 AD. Feared for their brutality and warfare, Vikings were and still are often described as the epitome of violence and savagery. And Yukimura doesn't romanticize this in the slightest, instead opting to show the Viking age in all its cruel detail. War, death, and grotesque imagery are the norm in this story, and violence is glorified by many of the characters within the story. People like Thorkel the Tall show off not just how normal war and conflict were for Viking society, but how nigh on essential it was too. Being a man in the Norse hierarchy means killing, plundering, and pillaging. Otherwise, you're an outcast, a coward, shunned by a society that rewards and encourages conflict. War is as much a political tool as it is a vocation and profession, death being dealt simply to alleviate tensions or, in the case of Thorkel, to just have fun. So, violence is a constant in Vinland Saga. Which makes it even more surprising when the main, central theme of the entire story reveals itself to be pacifism. The story goes to great lengths to not just explore violence and conflict, but also ponder the potential of pacifism and non-aggression. This starts with Thor's Snorreson, the troll of Yom and Thorfinn's father. But before we talk about any of that, I have to throw out a quick but thick spoiler warning. I will be talking about vast parts of the manga up to where it is currently. The anime is currently also airing, and if you're an anime only, this is where you might want to walk away. Vinland Saga is absolutely amazing, and I think you should experience it at your own pace. However, if you're fine with spoilers or if you've read the manga, good to go. A warrior without equal, he is the first character in the story to question the necessity of violence. This goes as far as him abandoning the way of war and going into hiding to live a peaceful life. This ultimately proves fruitless, however, as his past comes back to haunt and eventually kill him. Nonetheless, his words echo throughout the entire story. You don't have any enemies. No one has any enemies. A true warrior doesn't need a sword. These adages remain with young Thorfinn for a long, long time. Thor's words set the foundation for not only Thorfinn's change of character, but for a complete change of perspective. In the prologue arc, violence is depicted the way it's generally perceived by the setting. It's a necessary device by which the cogs of society are pushed to turn. And while it is occasionally questioned both by Canute's monk companion and Thorfinn's memories of Thor's, those quiet, somber moments are usually swept up in the maelstrom of violence and cruelty the prologue is drenched in. And that is by no means a bad thing. The story keeps its initial perspective on violence relatively pragmatic and doesn't ponder it too much, which is reflective of how Thorfinn views it while he works under Askeladd. However, once his vengeance, the core reason for all the cruelty he has committed, is swiftly stolen from him, both Thorfinn and the story experience a feeling of emptiness. The violence that, up to this point, had been flimsily justified with Thorfinn's revenge, reveals itself to have been utterly meaningless, despair created for no real tangible reason. Thorfinn ruined countless lives, and he has nothing to show for it. This begins Thorfinn's transformation into the pacifist he is currently in the manga. And this change feels incredibly rewarding precisely because of how unhinged and unconcerned the violence in the prologue was handled. In short, the contrast between the two mindsets maximizes the impact of the change. However, just because Thorfinn's views change doesn't mean the world follows suit. It remains the brutal place it's always been, filled with an entire society that glorifies warfare and violence as the only cause worth living and dying for. And thus, the true contrast of the series reveals itself. After Ketil's farm, Thorfinn believes that he and everyone else should always try to choose the first resort, meaning that one should always try diplomacy, discussion, and cooperation first. This is his solution to making the last resort, violence, as rare as possible. But not everyone agrees, obviously. After all, war and violence have proven incredibly beneficial to kings, raiders, warriors, and Vikings alike, with a lust and a necessity for bloodshed being deeply embedded into society itself. Thus, these two approaches are an inherent conflict, which also creates contrast. And the thing I love here is how these two contrasting ideas interact with each other. Thorfinn's epiphany about how combat only creates suffering and how being a true warrior means renouncing war entirely casts the Vikings' enthusiasm for violence into an ugly, almost juvenile light. As Thorfinn says, a man must plant more crops than he has trampled, build more homes than he has burned. In short, peace is productive, whereas war is destructive. But this initial boost of pacifism is countered with the realization that simply saying, "don't fight," just doesn't work. Among the countless warriors and Vikings living in Scandinavia, most of them are so ingrained in combat that the idea of just talking things out is almost naive. It's just not gonna happen. Therefore, it forces Thorfinn to reconsider his philosophy and try to compromise between those ideals and the practical reality he finds himself in. However, the world and its stance on violence isn't static either, at least not in the way it is presented. While the beginning portions of the story just depict violence without too much thought, as Thorfinn develops his ideals, the presence of violence becomes more nuanced. The focus isn't on cool action scenes anymore, well, not solely at least, but rather the idea of violence as a necessary evil that is inherent to human society. And as a result, the contrast between Thorfinn's pacifism and the world's violence create an amazing dichotomy. The two themes force each other to evolve and mature in order to stack up to one another. The vile, cruel, but relatively basic violence of the world pushes Thorfinn to develop his ideals of pacifism. In response, the story begins showing off violence in a more nuanced lens, showing that Thorfinn's approach is flawed. Thus, Thorfinn is forced to reevaluate his stance and try to find a more practical and realistic solution. And while this dialogue is still very much in progress, as Vinland Saga is allegedly only halfway done, it's already an approach I massively value. Having one central, steadfast theme is often a good thing for a story, but I think having two themes interact and evolve alongside each other dynamically like this, using the contrasting elements to bring out both the weaknesses and strengths of both ideas, is an excellent way of maintaining a consistent and competent dialogue of ideas within your story. It lends the story a thematic breadth that is exactly appropriate for discussing themes as large and important as war and pacifism. Violence isn't as simple as I want to fight, and peace isn't as simple as I don't want to fight. And Vinland Saga approaches both of these ideas at the same time. In essence, Yukimura's utilization of contrasting elements is something that has me massively excited for what different facets of peace and violence he will tackle in the future. Thank you all for watching. Subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. Like, share, whatever have you. Take care and be safe. Bye bye!